The shot rang out like a crack of thunder across the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies, echoing through the pine-scented air as Rose Thornton collapsed to the ground, her leg exploding with pain, unlike anything she'd ever known. It was May 1875, and what had begun as a promising expedition into the wilderness had just transformed into a nightmare that would forever alter the course of her life. "I'm sorry, Rose," Samuel Walsh said, his voice devoid of emotion as he stood over her crumpled form, rifle still smoking. "Gold makes men do terrible things." Rose clutched at her shattered leg, blood seeping between her fingers as she stared up at the man she'd trusted, the expedition leader who had promised to guide her safely through the mountains. Her sketching supplies lay scattered around her, the watercolors she'd so carefully packed now splashed across the rocky ground like her own blood. "The others won't be back for hours," Samuel continued, already gathering her satchel containing the maps she'd been commissioned to create. "By then, I'll be halfway to Denver with your work. I'll tell them it was a terrible accident, a bear, perhaps, a tragedy." "They'll never believe you," Rose spat through gritted teeth, fighting to remain conscious as waves of agony rolled through her body. Samuel smiled coldly. "A woman alone in the wilderness. They'll believe whatever I tell them." Then he was gone, disappearing into the dense forest, leaving nothing but the sound of retreating footsteps and Rose's labored breathing. At 24, she had prided herself on her independence, on being one of the few female cartographers brave enough to venture into these untamed territories. Now that same independence might cost her life. The sun moved slowly across the sky as Rose dragged herself toward a rocky outcropping that offered meager shelter. Each movement was torture, her broken leg trailing uselessly behind her. She knew the bone had shattered, she'd felt it splinter when the bullet tore through her flesh. The bleeding had slowed, but infection would soon follow without proper care. Night fell with a brutal swiftness in the mountains, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold that seeped through her clothes and into her very core. Rose had managed to bind her leg with strips torn from her petticoat, but the makeshift bandage did little to alleviate the pain. As darkness enveloped the landscape, the distant howl of wolves sent a different kind of fear coursing through her veins. "I will not die here," she whispered to herself, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "I will not give Samuel the satisfaction." Morning came, and with it delirium. Rose drifted in and out of consciousness, fever beginning to take hold as infection set in. She had no water, no food, and the pain in her leg had transformed into a strange, distant throbbing that she vaguely recognized as a dangerous sign. It was on the second day, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the mountain slope, that she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. At first she thought it was another fever dream, another cruel trick of her failing mind, but the rhythm was too consistent, too real. "Hello," she called, her voice barely more than a rasp. "Please, help." The hoofbeats stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then the crunch of boots on stone drawing closer. "Madam, you out here?" The voice was deep, tinged with a southern drawl that seemed out of place in these mountains. Rose tried to call out again, but her parched throat produced only a weak cough. It was enough. A tall figure appeared at the edge of her shelter, silhouetted against the harsh mountain sunlight. Rose squinted, unable to make out his features, seeing only the outline of a broad-shouldered man in a worn duster, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his face. "Good Lord," the man breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. "What happened to you?" Rose tried to speak, to explain about Samuel's betrayal, but the words wouldn't come. The stranger's face swam in and out of focus, strong jawline, weathered skin, eyes the color of a summer sky. "Don't try to talk," he said, already examining her leg with gentle but efficient hands. "This is bad. Real bad." He reached for his canteen, lifting it to her cracked lips. The water felt like heaven sliding down her throat, cool and sweet. Rose coughed, some of it spilling down her chin, but he patiently helped her take another sip. "My name's Finn. Finn Ellis," he said, his voice calm despite the gravity of the situation. "I've got a camp about 7 miles from here. I can help you, but I've got to move you, and it's going to hurt something fierce." Rose nodded weakly. "Rose, Thornton," she managed. "Miss Thornton, I'm going to pick you up now. I apologize for the impropriety." Before she could respond, he slid one arm beneath her knees and another behind her shoulders, lifting her with surprising gentleness. Even so, the movement sent daggers of pain shooting through her leg, and she couldn't suppress a cry of agony. I know," Finn murmured, his voice low and soothing as he carried her toward his waiting horse. "Just hold on. I've got you." The horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stood patiently as Finn somehow managed to mount while still cradling Rose in his arms. He positioned her carefully across his lap, supporting her injured leg. "This ain't ideal," he said, adjusting her weight slightly, "but it's the only way. We can't stay here. Night's coming, and those wolves you've been hearing ain't just passing through." Rose's head rested against his chest, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat oddly comforting as they began their slow journey. Each step the horse took sent jolts of pain through her leg, but she bit her lip to keep from crying out. "You can scream if you need to," Finn said, seeming to sense her struggle. "Ain't nobody out here to hear but me and the horse, and neither of us minds much." Despite herself, Rose let out a weak laugh that quickly transformed into a sob. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the sound of the horse's hooves. Finn was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Out here, we help folks in need. That's just how it is. Would be a poor excuse for a man if I left a lady to die in the wilderness." The journey seemed endless, a blur of pain and the gentle rocking motion of the horse. Rose drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally waking to find herself still cradled against Finn's chest, his arms steady around her. At some point, he draped his duster over her to ward off the mountain chill. "Stay with me, Miss Thornton," he would say whenever her eyes fluttered open. "Just a little further now." It was nearly dusk when they reached his camp, a small cabin nestled among a stand of pines, smoke curling from its stone chimney. A dog, some kind of shepherd mix, bounded toward them, barking excitedly. "Quiet, Scout," Finn commanded, and the dog immediately fell silent, though it continued to circle the horse anxiously, with remarkable care. Finn dismounted, somehow managing to keep Rose secure in his arms. The movement still sent fresh waves of agony through her leg, and she couldn't hold back a cry of pain. "Almost there," he promised, carrying her toward the cabin door. He pushed it open with his foot, revealing a simple but tidy interior: a small table and chairs, a cast iron stove, shelves stocked with provisions, and a narrow bed pushed against one wall. Finn gently laid her on the bed, immediately moving to build up the fire in the stove. Rose watched through pain-glazed eyes as he moved efficiently around the cabin, gathering supplies: clean cloths, a basin of water, what looked like a bottle of whiskey. "Miss Thornton," he said, kneeling beside the bed, "I need to clean that wound and set your leg. It's going to hurt worse than anything you've ever felt." Rose nodded weakly. "Do what you must." He offered her the whiskey bottle. "Drink as much as you can stomach." The liquor burned down her throat, but Rose welcomed the spreading warmth. Finn waited patiently as she took several long swallows before setting the bottle aside. "I've some experience with wounds," he explained, carefully cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of her trousers. Spent 2 years as a field medic during the war. Which side? Rose asked, trying to distract herself from what was coming. Finn's hands paused briefly. Union, though that don't matter much out here. He worked methodically, cleaning the wound with a gentleness that belied his rough exterior. The bullet had gone clean through, he explained, which was fortunate, but the bone was badly broken. When it came time to set it, he gave her a thick piece of leather to bite down on. Ready? He asked, his blue eyes meeting hers. Rose nodded, gripping the edges of the bed. The pain was blinding, overwhelming, consuming every part of her consciousness. Rose screamed against the leather, her back arching off the bed as Finn's strong hands manipulated the broken bone. The last thing she remembered before darkness claimed her was his voice, steady and reassuring, telling her she was going to be all right. She woke to sunlight filtering through a small window, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or what had happened. Then the pain in her leg brought it all flooding back: Samuel's betrayal, the gunshot, being left to die, and the stranger who had carried her to safety. Finn was sitting at the small table, whittling something with a pocket knife. He looked up immediately as she stirred, setting aside his work and crossing to her side. "Welcome back," he said, a relieved smile crossing his face. "Was starting to worry you might sleep another day away." "Another day?" Rose's voice was hoarse. "How long was I unconscious?" "Near on 20 hours, Finn replied, reaching for a cup of water and helping her drink. "Fever broke early this morning, which is a good sign. You're tough as pine knots, Miss Thornton." Rose managed a weak smile. "Rose, please, I think we're well past formalities, Mr. Ellis." "Finn, then." He checked her forehead with the back of his hand. "Still warm, but much better. How's the pain?" "Terrible," she admitted. "But bearable." Finn nodded approvingly. "I made a splint for your leg. It'll need to stay immobile for several weeks, maybe longer." The bone was badly splintered. Reality began to settle in as Rose looked around the small cabin. "I can't impose on you for weeks." "Surely there's a town nearby where I could." "Nearest town is Fort Collins, and it's 4 days' ride in good weather," Finn interrupted. "And you ain't riding anywhere for a good long while. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "ain't like I get much company out here." Rose studied him properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his faded blue shirt. His face was tanned and weathered from life outdoors, but his eyes were kind, crinkling at the corners when he smiled. "Why do you live so far from civilization?" she asked. Finn's expression grew guarded. "Some men fit better in towns, others don't." He stood, changing the subject. "You must be hungry. I've got some stew simmering." Over the next few days, Rose gradually regained her strength. The fever subsided completely, though the pain in her leg remained a constant companion. Finn proved to be an attentive caretaker, changing her bandages, preparing simple but nourishing meals, and even helping her to the outhouse when necessary, an arrangement that mortified Rose at first, though Finn handled it with such matter-of-fact practicality that she eventually overcame her embarrassment. In the evenings, they would talk. Finn was well read for a mountain man, and their conversations ranged from literature to politics to the changing landscape of the West. Rose told him about her work as a cartographer, how she'd been commissioned by a Denver publishing house to map the lesser-known regions of the Colorado Rockies. "That explains why you were out there alone," Finn said one evening as he mended a tear in one of his shirts. "Though not why you ended up shot and abandoned." Rose hesitated, then told him everything about Samuel Walsh and his betrayal. Finn listened silently, his expression darkening as she described how Samuel had stolen her maps and left her to die. "Men like that give the rest of us a bad name," he said when she'd finished, his voice tight with anger. "If I ever cross paths with this Walsh fellow—" "You won't," Rose said quickly. "He'll be long gone by now, probably claiming my work as his own in Denver." Finn studied her for a moment. "You worked hard on those maps." "Years of my life," Rose admitted. "My father was a cartographer. He taught me everything I know, encouraged me when others said it was no profession for a woman." She smiled sadly. "He died 2 years ago. These maps were to be my tribute to him in a way." Finn nodded thoughtfully, but said nothing more on the subject. The next morning, Rose woke to find him gone, a note on the table saying he'd gone hunting and would return by nightfall. Scout, the dog, had been left behind, keeping faithful watch from the foot of her bed. True to his word, Finn returned as the sun was setting, a pair of rabbits slung over his shoulder. But he also carried something else, a stack of papers and several pencils. "Thought you might like to start again," he said, almost shyly, placing them on the bed beside her. "Can't replace what was stolen, but maybe." Rose touched the papers with trembling fingers. "Where did you get these?" "Had them stored away. Used to do some surveying myself before." He trailed off. "Anyway, figured they'd be better used by someone with your talent." It was the kindest gift anyone had given her in a long time. Rose found herself blinking back tears as she thanked him. That night, she began sketching from memory, trying to recreate the maps Samuel had stolen. It wasn't the same. She needed to be in the field to create truly accurate cartography, but the familiar activity soothed her spirit. As the days turned into weeks, Rose discovered an unexpected contentment in the simple routine of life in Finn's cabin. Though still confined to bed most of the time, she began to sit up for longer periods, eventually graduating to a chair by the window where she could sketch and watch the changing mountain light. Finn proved to be more complex than she'd initially assumed. He was clearly educated and occasionally referenced books and ideas that suggested a background far removed from his current solitary existence. Yet he deflected most personal questions with practiced ease, particularly anything about his life after the war, or why he'd chosen this isolated existence. It was nearly 3 weeks into her stay when Rose finally breached the subject directly. They had finished supper, a flavorful venison stew, and Finn was smoking his pipe by the fire while Rose worked on her maps. "You never speak of your family," she observed, setting aside her pencil. "Do you have any?" Finn's expression remained neutral, but she noticed his fingers tighten slightly around the pipe stem. "Had a brother, lost him at Gettysburg." "I'm sorry," Rose said softly. Finn nodded his acknowledgement. "Parents passed before the war. Father from consumption, mother from grief not long after." "And afterward?" "After the war, I mean. You must have had a life before you came to these mountains." There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Just as Rose was beginning to think he wouldn't answer, Finn spoke. "I was a doctor for a time, in St. Louis. Had a practice, a fiancée named Margaret. Good life." He tapped his pipe against the hearth, emptying the ashes. "Then the nightmares started. Couldn't sleep. Saw the faces of all the boys I couldn't save on the battlefield. Started drinking to quiet them." Rose remained silent, sensing he needed to tell this story at his own pace. "Lost the practice. Lost Margaret. Found myself drifting west. Worked as a field doctor for the railroad for a spell, then as a company physician at a mine near Denver." His voice grew distant. "There was an accident. 37 men trapped. I worked 3 days straight trying to save the ones we could pull out. Lost 17 of them anyway." He stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the darkness. "After that, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't bear to lose another patient, so I came up here. Been 5 years now. You haven't lost your skill, Rose said gently. You saved me. Finn turned back to her, a sad smile on his face. Maybe, but you were the first person I've treated in a long time. Understanding dawned on Rose. That's why you were so far out in the wilderness. You weren't just hunting. I check the old trails every few weeks, Finn admitted. Prospectors, trappers, lost travelers, folks get in trouble out here. I don't practice medicine anymore, but I can't just let someone die if I can help. The revelation shifted something in Rose's perception of him. What she had taken for misanthropy was something more complex, a wounded healer who had withdrawn from the world but couldn't fully abandon his calling. Thank you for telling me, she said simply. Finn nodded once, then changed the subject. Let's see how that leg's doing. The examination revealed significant improvement. The wound had closed cleanly, and while the bone was still knitting, Finn declared she could try standing the next day with assistance. That first attempt was both triumphant and humbling. With Finn's strong arm around her waist, Rose managed to stand upright, putting the slightest weight on her injured leg. The pain was immediate and intense, but the simple act of being vertical after weeks of lying down felt like a victory. Well done, Finn said, his voice warm with approval. A few minutes each day, and you'll be walking before you know it. Rose looked up at him, suddenly aware of their proximity, of his arm securely around her, of the clean scent of pine and soap that clung to him. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a current of awareness that neither had acknowledged until that moment. Finn cleared his throat, helping her back to the chair. That's enough for today, he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. Don't want to push too hard. The next few days brought a subtle shift in their interactions. There was a new awareness between them, an undercurrent that manifested in small ways, lingering glances, fingers brushing during the passing of a plate, conversations that stretched late into the night. Neither addressed it directly, but Rose found herself increasingly attuned to Finn's presence, to the sound of his voice, to the rare occasions when he laughed. June blossomed into July, bringing warmer days and spectacular mountain thunderstorms that crashed and echoed through the peaks. Rose's recovery continued steadily. With the aid of a crutch Finn had fashioned, she could now move around the cabin independently and even venture onto the small porch when the weather was fine. It was on such an evening, as they sat watching a spectacular sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, that Finn finally broached the subject they'd both been avoiding. You'll be well enough to travel soon, he said, his eyes fixed on the distant peaks. Another few weeks, maybe less. Rose's heart constricted at his words. The thought of leaving this place, of returning to her previous life, filled her with an unexpected sadness. Yes, I suppose I will. I could take you to Fort Collins, Finn continued, his voice carefully neutral. You could catch the stage to Denver from there, reclaim your work if that Walsh fellow hasn't already published it. Is that what you want? Rose asked quietly. For me to leave? Finn turned to look at her then, his blue eyes intense. What I want doesn't signify much, Miss Thornton. You have a life to return to, a career, prospects, Rose, she corrected gently, and you haven't answered my question. A muscle worked in Finn's jaw as he seemed to struggle with himself. No, he finally admitted, his voice low. That's not what I want. But I've got no right to ask you to stay in this wilderness with a broken-down doctor who couldn't face his failures. Rose reached out, placing her hand over his where it rested on the porch railing. You're not broken, Finn. Wounded, perhaps, as we all are in different ways, but not broken. He stared at her hand atop his, then slowly turned his palm upward, his fingers curling around hers. Rose, he said, her name almost a whisper on his lips. The kiss, when it came, was gentle, a tentative exploration, a question asked and answered in the same breath. Rose leaned into him, her free hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. When they finally parted, Finn rested his forehead against hers. "I had no intention of this happening," he murmured. Rose smiled. "Neither did I. But I'm not sorry that it did." "What happens now?" he asked, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "I don't know," Rose admitted, "but I'm not ready to leave these mountains yet, or you." That night, despite the impropriety of it, Rose asked Finn to stay with her. They did nothing more than hold each other, his strong arms around her as they talked late into the night, sharing stories and secrets that had remained unspoken until now. Rose told him of her mother's early death, of growing up as the only girl among 3 brothers, of her determination to follow her father's footsteps, despite society's disapproval. Finn spoke of his childhood in Tennessee, of medical school in Philadelphia, of the horrors and occasional moments of grace he'd witnessed during the war. In the days that followed, their relationship blossomed into something neither had expected to find in these remote mountains. Finn remained respectful of Rose's virtue, mindful of her still healing body, but their evenings were filled with increasingly passionate embraces and the growing certainty that what they had found was rare and precious. July gave way to August, and Rose's leg continued to heal. She could now walk short distances without the crutch, though Finn cautioned her against overexertion. Together they ventured further from the cabin each day to a nearby stream where trout flashed silver in the clear water, to a meadow bursting with wildflowers, to a rocky outcropping that offered breathtaking views of the surrounding wilderness. It was during one such excursion, as they sat sharing a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and dried apple slices, that Finn suddenly grew serious. "I've been thinking," he said, carefully selecting his words, "about the future, about what comes next." Rose felt a flutter of apprehension. "And what have you concluded?" "That I don't want to lose you." Finn met her gaze directly. "I know it's selfish. You have your career, your life in civilization, but these past months with you, I've felt alive again, Rose, in a way I haven't since before the war." Hope bloomed in Rose's chest. "Are you asking me to stay, Finn?" "I'm asking if you might consider a life here, with me." He gestured to the wilderness around them. "It's a hard life in many ways, isolated, rough, but there's beauty here too, freedom." "And what would I do with my cartography?" Rose asked, not dismissively but genuinely curious about how he envisioned their future. Finn smiled. "These mountains are largely unmapped. You could continue your work here, create the most detailed maps these territories have ever seen. We could make occasional trips to Fort Collins, to Denver if needed. I'm not asking you to abandon your career, Rose, just to consider pursuing it from a different home." Rose considered his words thoughtfully. The prospect was both daunting and exhilarating. "And what of you? Would you consider practicing medicine again?" It was Finn's turn to look surprised. "I hadn't thought." "You have a gift, Finn," Rose said earnestly. "I've seen it in how you cared for me. There are settlements growing throughout these mountains, mining camps, small towns. They need doctors desperately." Finn was silent for a long moment. "I'm not sure I can go back to that life," he finally said. "The responsibility, the inevitability of losing patients. Perhaps not as you did before," Rose suggested, "but on your own terms. You could still live here, still have this sanctuary, but perhaps ride out when needed. Save those you can, without carrying the burden of an entire hospital on your shoulders." The idea seemed to take root in Finn's mind. "It would mean being away sometimes, leaving you alone here." Rose laughed softly. "I think I've proven I can be quite resilient, despite occasional setbacks involving bullets and broken legs." Finn chuckled, then grew serious again. "You're really considering this, staying here?" In answer, Rose leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all her newfound certainty into the gesture. When they parted, she said simply, "I love you, Finn Ellis. I didn't expect to find you, especially not under such circumstances, but now that I have, I don't intend to walk away." Finn's eyes shone with emotion. "I love you too, Rose Thornton, more than I thought possible." They returned to the cabin hand in hand, the future suddenly bright with possibilities neither had imagined just months before. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge in the velvet mountain sky, Finn reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. "I've been working on this," he said, a hint of nervousness in his voice as he placed it in Rose's palm. It was a ring, carved from a piece of antler, polished to a soft sheen and inlaid with a tiny piece of turquoise. The craftsmanship was remarkable, especially considering the limited tools at Finn's disposal. "It's not gold or diamonds," Finn said apologetically. "When the time is right, when we can get to town, I'll get you a proper—" "It's perfect," Rose interrupted, slipping it onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." Finn's face broke into a radiant smile. "Is that a yes, then?" "Yes," Rose said simply. "Yes to everything, to you, to this life, to our future together." The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher who happened to be passing through the area on his circuit. The only witnesses were a trapper and his wife, who lived in a cabin some 5 miles distant, the closest neighbors Finn had in these mountains. Rose wore her best dress, freshly laundered and adorned with wildflowers Finn had gathered that morning. Finn had shaved carefully and donned a clean shirt that Rose had mended. The preacher read from his well-worn Bible, the familiar words taking on new meaning in this wild setting, beneath the vast blue sky with the mountains standing as ancient witnesses. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared, closing his Bible with a smile. "You may kiss your bride, Dr. Ellis." And Finn did, pulling Rose into his arms with a tenderness that belied his strength. As their lips met, Rose knew with absolute certainty that this unexpected path, beginning with betrayal and a bullet, pain and near death, had led her exactly where she was meant to be. That night, as husband and wife, they came together in a union that was both passionate and reverent, exploring each other with wonder and growing desire. In Finn's gentle hands and fervent kisses, Rose discovered sensations she had never imagined, culminating in a pleasure so intense it brought tears to her eyes. Afterward, as they lay entwined, Finn traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "Happy?" he asked, his voice husky in the darkness. "Completely," Rose answered, nestling closer to his warmth. "Though I still can hardly believe how we found each other." Finn's arms tightened around her. "I thank God every day that I decided to check that trail, that I found you in time." "As do I," Rose murmured, already drifting towards sleep, secure in her husband's embrace. Fall came to the mountains in a blaze of color, aspen groves turning to gold, underbrush flaming red and orange, the air growing crisp with the promise of winter. Rose's leg had healed well, though it still ached when storms approached, a barometer she suspected would remain with her for life. True to their discussions, Finn had cautiously begun offering his medical services to the scattered inhabitants of the region. Word spread quickly, and soon trappers, prospectors, and settlers from miles around would appear at their door seeking his expertise. Some could pay only with game or pelts, others with nothing at all, but Finn turned no one away. Rose, meanwhile, had embarked on an ambitious project to create detailed maps of the surrounding territories. She accompanied Finn on many of his medical journeys, sketching as they traveled, noting landmarks, water sources, and trails that existed on no official map. When winter's approach made such expeditions impractical, she worked indoors, transferring her field sketches to larger, more permanent formats. In November, they made the journey to Fort Collins, where Rose arranged to sell some of her completed maps to a publisher who recognized their exceptional quality. The money allowed them to purchase supplies for the winter flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, fabric for new clothes, and most precious of all, books to sustain them through the long mountain nights ahead. While in town, Finn also acquired basic medical supplies and several current medical journals, reconnecting with the profession he had once abandoned. Rose watched with pride as he consulted with the town's only doctor, the two men speaking as colleagues, sharing knowledge and experience. As they prepared for the journey back to their mountain home, loading their pack horses with their purchases, the publisher approached Rose with an intriguing proposition. "Mrs. Ellis," he said, holding one of her maps, "this work is exceptional. I've never seen the territory rendered with such precision and detail. Would you consider accepting a commission for a complete atlas of the Central Rockies? The mining companies, the railroad, even the territorial government would pay handsomely for such information." Rose glanced at Finn, who nodded encouragingly. "I would be interested," she said, "though I should warn you that I work from our home in the mountains. Submissions would be irregular, depending on weather and other factors." The publisher waved away her concerns. "Quality like this is worth waiting for, Mrs. Ellis. We can establish a schedule that accommodates your circumstances." The contract they negotiated provided a generous advance and the promise of royalties on all published copies. As they rode away from Fort Collins, Rose couldn't help but laugh at the unexpected turn of events. "What's amusing you?" Finn asked, smiling at her obvious delight. "Just thinking about Samuel Walsh," Rose replied. "He shot me and left me to die for a few basic survey maps. Now I have a contract for an entire atlas, a husband I adore, and a life I wouldn't trade for all the comfort and convenience of the city." Finn reached across to take her hand. "Life has a way of balancing accounts eventually." The winter of 1875-76 proved to be one of the harshest in memory, with snow piling deep around their cabin and temperatures plummeting far below freezing. Yet inside, warmth prevailed. They settled into a comfortable routine, Finn hunting when weather permitted, tending to occasional patients who braved the snow to seek his help, and assisting Rose with her maps. Rose divided her time between cartography, household tasks, and reading aloud from their precious books during the long evenings. It was during one such blizzard, with wind howling around the eaves and snow drifting past the windows, that Rose first suspected she might be with child. She had missed her monthly courses twice now, and certain foods that she had previously enjoyed now turned her stomach. She said nothing to Finn at first, wanting to be certain before raising his hopes. By Christmas, there was no longer any doubt. As they sat before the fire that evening, having enjoyed a special meal of venison roast and preserved berries, Rose placed Finn's hand gently on her still flat abdomen. "I have a gift for you," she said softly, "though it won't arrive until summer." Finn's eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Rose, are you certain?" She nodded, her eyes shining. "Quite certain. You're going to be a father, Dr. Ellis." The joy that transformed his face was beautiful to behold. Finn gathered her into his arms, his hands trembling slightly as he held her. "I never thought, after everything, that I would have this chance," he whispered against her hair. "A family of my own." "Are you pleased then?" Rose asked, drawing back to see his face. "Please doesn't begin to describe it," Finn answered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm overwhelmed, terrified, ecstatic." He placed his hand once more on her abdomen, a gesture of wonder and protection. Our child, our future. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Finn insisted that Rose reduce her activities as her pregnancy progressed, though she stubbornly continued working on her maps until her expanding waistline made it impossible to bend comfortably over the drafting table. They converted a corner of the cabin into a nursery, with Finn crafting a cradle from pine wood and Rose sewing tiny garments from soft flannel. As spring melted the snow and brought new life to the mountains, Rose's body blossomed with their growing child. Finn watched over her with tender vigilance, applying his medical knowledge to ensure her health and comfort. His practice had grown steadily, with more settlers arriving in the region each month, drawn by reports of gold and silver in the mountains, or simply the promise of land and freedom. Word of the skilled doctor who had returned to medicine spread, bringing patients from ever greater distances. By June, Rose found it difficult to move comfortably, the summer heat adding to her discomfort. Finn arranged their cabin to catch every possible breeze and made frequent trips to the stream to bring back cool water for her to bathe her face and arms. In quiet moments, they would sit together on the porch, discussing names for their child and sharing dreams for the future. "I've been thinking," Finn said one evening, his hand resting on Rose's swollen belly where their child kicked vigorously. "Perhaps we should consider building a larger cabin, not immediately but before winter returns." Rose looked at him curiously. "I thought you loved this place." "I do," Finn assured her, "but our family is growing, and my practice, well, it's becoming difficult to treat patients in our living space, especially with a baby soon to be underfoot." "What are you suggesting?" Rose asked, intrigued. Finn gestured toward a clearing visible through the trees. "I own this entire valley, 40 acres in all. I was thinking we might build a proper house there, with rooms for our family and a separate space for my medical practice. Perhaps even a small room dedicated to your cartography." The thought was appealing, a home designed for their growing family and their respective work, yet still nestled in the wilderness they both had come to love. "It sounds wonderful," Rose agreed. "Though perhaps we should wait until after this little one arrives before embarking on such an ambitious project." Finn laughed, kissing her forehead. "Agreed. One momentous event at a time." The momentous event in question arrived on a sweltering July afternoon. Rose's labor began at dawn, strong and steady from the first contraction. Finn sent their nearest neighbor to fetch the midwife who lived some 10 miles distant, but it soon became apparent that the baby would arrive before help could reach them. Drawing on his medical training, Finn prepared as best he could, sterilizing instruments and readying clean linens. Still, as Rose's labor intensified, beads of sweat formed on his brow that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "You look more frightened than I feel," Rose observed during a brief respite between contractions, managing a weak smile despite her exhaustion. Finn wiped her face with a cool cloth. "I've delivered babies before," he admitted, "but never my own child, never with the woman I love." "Then we'll do this together," Rose said, gripping his hand as another contraction began to build. "As we've done everything else." The hours that followed tested them both. Rose's strength and determination amazed Finn as she labored tirelessly, following his gentle instructions without complaint, despite the intensity of the pain. When finally the moment of birth arrived, Finn's hands were steady and sure, guiding their child safely into the world. "We have a son," he announced, his voice breaking with emotion as he placed the squalling infant on Rose's chest. "A perfect, healthy son." Rose cradled the tiny form against her skin, tears streaming down her face as she counted fingers and toes, marveling at the miracle they had created. The baby had a shock of dark hair, still damp from birth, and when he opened his eyes they were the same clear blue as his father's. "Robert," she whispered. "Robert Finnegan Ellis, after my father and his father." Finn nodded, too overcome to speak as he sat beside them on the bed, one arm around Rose's shoulders, the other hand gently touching his son's head. They remained thus, a family newly complete, until the midwife finally arrived to find her services needed only for confirmation that mother and child were indeed well. The first year of Robert's life brought changes both expected and surprising. The baby thrived in the mountain air, growing strong and curious about the world around him. Rose recovered quickly from childbirth and resumed her mapping work, often with Robert sleeping peacefully in a cradle beside her drafting table or strapped to her chest in a clever sling Finn had designed. True to his word, Finn began construction on their new home as soon as Robert was 2 months old, enlisting the help of neighbors and passing travelers who were willing to work in exchange for medical care or a few coins. By the first snowfall, the main structure was complete, a sturdy log house with a stone foundation, multiple rooms including a dedicated surgery for Finn's practice, and large windows to capture the spectacular mountain views that Rose so loved. Their second winter in the mountains was as different from the first as could be imagined. Now they had a warm, spacious home, a thriving baby boy, established professions, and a growing circle of friends and neighbors. The isolation that had once defined Finn's existence had given way to a life rich with connection and purpose. Spring brought more changes as settlers continued to flood into the region. A small community began to form in the valley below their property, first a general store, then a blacksmith, eventually a one-room schoolhouse. Though still miles from any established town, they were no longer truly alone in the wilderness. On Robert's first birthday, celebrated with a small gathering of friends and neighbors, Finn presented Rose with a surprise, a proper gold wedding band to accompany the carved antler ring she still wore faithfully. "Not that there was anything wrong with my handiwork," he teased as he slipped it onto her finger, "but I thought you deserved something lasting." "I'll wear both," Rose declared, admiring how the simple gold band complemented the unique ring that symbolized the beginning of their life together, each precious in its own way. Later that evening, after their guests had departed and Robert slept peacefully in his crib, Rose and Finn sat together on the porch of their new home, watching the stars emerge above the darkening mountains. "Did you ever imagine this?" Rose asked, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "When you found me broken and abandoned, did you ever imagine we would come to this?" Finn was quiet for a moment, his arm tightening around her. "No," he finally admitted. "I only knew I couldn't leave you there. That something compelled me to ride that particular trail on that particular day." "Providence," Rose suggested. "Perhaps." Finn smiled down at her. "Or perhaps just extraordinary good fortune. Either way, I thank God every day for leading me to you." Rose turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face, tracing the features that had become so dear to her. "As do I," she whispered. "As do I." Their lips met in a kiss that still held all the wonder of their first embrace, yet now carried the depth and richness that comes only with shared experience, with a love tested and proven through joy and hardship alike. As the mountain night enfolded them, Rose knew with unshakable certainty that this was exactly where she belonged in these wild mountains, in the arms of the man who had carried her not just for miles across the wilderness, but into a life more fulfilling than she had ever dared to dream. In the years that followed, their family and their legacy grew together. Rose's Atlas of the Central Rockies became an essential resource for settlers, miners, and government officials, establishing her reputation as the foremost cartographer of the region. Finn's medical practice expanded to the point where he eventually took on an apprentice, a young man eager to learn from a doctor, whose skill and compassion had become legendary throughout the territory. Robert was joined by two sisters, Catherine in 1878 and Elizabeth in 1881, and finally, another brother, James, in 1884. All four children inherited their parents' intelligence and determination, though they expressed these qualities in different ways. Robert followed his father into medicine. Catherine became a teacher in the school that now served their growing community. Elizabeth discovered a talent for writing that led her to chronicle the changing West, and James combined his mother's eye for geography with a keen business sense, eventually establishing a successful surveying company that helped shape the development of Colorado. The small settlement that had begun near their home eventually grew into a proper town, informally known as Ellis Valley, in recognition of the doctor and mapmaker, whose presence had drawn many of the original settlers. Rose and Finn remained in their mountain home, witnessing the transformation of the wilderness they had once known, yet always maintaining their deep connection to the land and to each other. In 1899, as the century drew to a close, they celebrated their silver wedding anniversary surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and a community that would not have existed without them. Rose, her dark hair now streaked with silver but her eyes still bright with intelligence and humor, stood beside Finn, whose tall frame remained strong despite the passage of years. 25 years, Finn marveled as they shared a quiet moment away from the festivities. Sometimes it seems like yesterday that I found you in the mountains, and sometimes it feels like we've always been together, Rose replied, her hand finding his with the easy familiarity of long companionship. As though everything before was merely preparation for the life we were meant to share. Finn nodded, understanding perfectly. I never told you, he said after a moment, but I almost didn't take that trail the day I found you. Had half a mind to head home. Early storm was brewing, game was scarce. What changed your mind? Rose asked, though she had a sense she already knew the answer. Couldn't say exactly, just a feeling, like something important was waiting. Finn's weathered face creased in a smile. Turned out to be the most important thing of all. Rose leaned into him, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder as they gazed out at the valley that had been transformed during their quarter-century together. Fields and orchards now spread where once there had been only wilderness. A proper road connected them to the larger world. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the town below. Yet the essential beauty remained: the towering mountains, the clear blue sky, the whispering pines. And at the heart of it all, the love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. A wounded woman abandoned to die, a solitary man who had carried her to safety, and the extraordinary journey that had brought them home.